Hello everyone, and welcome back to Nocturnal Narrative Studio. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep, so before you drift off, I'd love it if you could subscribe to my lovely channel and leave a comment letting me know which country you're listening from around the world. So, without further ado, let's begin the story. Story 1. I never planned on spending that summer working nights in a cemetery, let alone sharing the job with someone I thought I knew. When my cousin Eerie called me in late May, his voice casual, almost cheerful, I didn't hear the warning signs. He said the groundskeeper at St. Bartholomew's needed extra hands, grave restoration, night patrols, basic maintenance. Easy money, he said, quiet place. You like quiet. He reminded me I'd been drifting since the divorce, crashing on couches, needing a reset. I trusted him. I always had. Looking back, though, trust was the first thing I buried out there. St. Bartholomew's Cemetery sat on the edge of town, a patchwork of sinking stones and crooked angels surrounded by old oak trees that never quite stopped creaking. The caretaker's house was a narrow, two-story structure with yellowed siding and a porch that sagged in the middle. Eerie already lived there, had for months, and insisted I take the spare bedroom. I hesitated. Living on cemetery grounds felt like tempting fate, but he laughed it off. "You'll sleep like a baby," he said. Dead quiet. The first few nights proved him right. I liked the routine. Sunset checks, locking the wrought iron gates, walking the gravel paths with a flashlight and clipboard. Crickets chirred. Wind whispered through leaves. The headstones glowed pale in the moonlight, names and dates worn smooth by time. It felt solemn, respectful, even comforting, in a strange way. I'd sit on the porch afterward, drinking cheap beer with Eerie, talking about nothing important. He seemed relaxed, grounded, happier than I remembered. I'll skip the boring stuff, weeks of uneventful patrols, aching muscles, the smell of damp earth that clung to my clothes. What matters is that the cemetery started to feel familiar, almost friendly. I knew which graves leaned, which angels had lost fingers, which mausoleum doors rattled when the wind hit just right. I stopped jumping at every sound. That's probably when I got careless. The first red flag was my watch. A cheap thing, scratched face, but it had belonged to my father. I took it off every night before bed, left it on the dresser. One morning it was gone. I tore the room apart, convinced I'd knocked it somewhere stupid. When I mentioned it to Eerie, he shrugged. "Old house," he said. "Stuff falls into cracks. You sure you didn't leave it outside?" I felt embarrassed for even asking. Then my notebook disappeared. I kept notes, grave numbers that needed repair, odd noises I wanted to remember, sketches of stones with unusual carvings. I knew exactly where I left it on the kitchen table, under my keys. Gone. Eerie laughed again, said I was working too much, needed sleep. The groundskeeper, Mr. Harlan, was no help either. He waved me off when I mentioned missing items. "You're not the first to misplace things out here," he said. Cemetery plays tricks on the mind. After that, little things kept happening. My boots were turned the wrong way when I woke up. The porch light flicked on by itself at 3:17 a.m. every night. I'd hear footsteps crunching gravel long after Eerie claimed to be asleep. When I asked him about it, he said it was probably deer, or kids hopping the fence, or me dreaming. I started doubting myself, questioning my memory, my sanity. At night, the cemetery changed. Sounds carried differently. A cough echoed like a shout. A shovel scraping somewhere far off made my skin prickle. Once, during patrol, I heard someone whisper my name from behind a row of crypts. I spun around, heart pounding, flashlight shaking. Nothing, just the stone faces staring back. I told myself it was wind through cracks, imagination filling gaps. That excuse got harder to believe when I found fresh dirt piled beside an old family plot. One we hadn't scheduled for work. The earth was loose, dark, recently turned. I marked it down, told Mr. Harlan. He frowned, said records showed no recent burial there. Probably erosion, he muttered. But erosion doesn't leave shovel marks. My paranoia grew in small, steady increments. I started locking my bedroom door. I hid my remaining belongings in my backpack, slept with it under the bed. Eli noticed. His jokes turned sharp. "You think I'm stealing from you?" he asked one night, eyes glittering. I backtracked, apologized. That's when it hit me. I was afraid of him. Not because of anything specific he'd done, but because of how easily he dismissed my fear. The major discovery happened on a night thick with fog. Visibility was maybe 10 feet, flashlight beams swallowed by white. I almost skipped patrol, but routine had become my anchor. Halfway through the eastern section, I noticed a mausoleum door ajar. I knew that door. I'd checked it every night. It was always locked. Inside, the air was cold and smelled of mildew and something coppery. My light swept over stone shelves, coffins sealed decades ago. At the back, behind a stack of broken tiles, I saw a metal lockbox. My father's watch sat on top of it. My hands shook as I opened the box. Inside were photographs, Polaroids curled at the edges. They showed graves mid-excavation, coffins opened, personal effects laid out on tarps. Some photos showed hands, alive, dirty, unmistakably human, reaching out from beneath the soil. There were notes too, in Eli's handwriting, dates, names, observations about movement, breathing, resistance. I don't remember leaving the mausoleum. I remember sitting on the porch later, head in my hands, the lockbox at my feet. Eli came home at dawn. When he saw the box, his face went slack. The confrontation was ugly, shouting, denial, then anger. He admitted enough, said Mr. Harlan knew. Said it was research, that some people weren't fully gone when buried, that the cemetery was special. I ran. Police got involved. Mr. Harlan vanished. Eli was taken in for questioning, released days later for lack of evidence. The cemetery closed. I moved states, changed numbers, thought it was over. Last week, my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. A photo loaded slowly, fresh dirt, a familiar headstone. My name carved beneath my birth date, no death date yet. The caption read, "You left something behind." Story 2. I need to say this up front, because people always jump to conclusions when I talk about my family. We're not weird, not dangerous, not some backwoods cult playing dress up in a cemetery. We're structured. We're cautious. We follow rules. The tradition we keep has been in our family longer than the town itself, and until last year, no one ever got hurt. So when I sound defensive, it's because I'm tired of outsiders assuming the problem was us. Every October, my extended family gathers at Hollow Creek Memorial Park after closing hours. It's private land on paper, technically owned by my great-uncle's trust, and we have written permission to be there. We don't vandalize. We don't disturb graves. We conduct what we call the night walk. Looking back, though, calling it that feels like tempting fate. The night walk started as a way to honor our dead. It evolved, like traditions do. There are rules, always have been. We meet at the South Iron Gate at exactly 11:30 p.m. Everyone wears neutral clothing, no reflective materials. Flashlights are allowed but must be red, lens only, kept pointed at the ground unless signaling. No phones, no calling out names. You stay in pairs, no exceptions. If you hear footsteps that don't match your partner's pace, you stop immediately and wait. If you see someone you don't recognize, you do not engage. You return to the gate. I know how that sounds. But when you grow up with it, it's just protocol. Last year was my cousin Mara's first time joining as an adult. She was excited, nervous, asking 1,000 questions. I stuck close to her, explaining the equipment, handheld radios set to channel 3, spare batteries taped to the backs, emergency whistles we were never supposed to use. I'll skip the boring stuff about family roll calls and assignments. But by midnight we were moving through the cemetery in practiced silence, gravel crunching softly under our boots. At first, everything felt right, familiar. The stones reflected moonlight the same way they always had. The air smelled like wet leaves and old marble. I focused on counting steps between landmarks, a grounding trick my father taught me. Mara squeezed my arm once, smiling. She whispered that she felt silly being scared. I told her fear meant you were paying attention. About 20 minutes in, my radio crackled, not static, but breathing, slow, deliberate. I checked the channel. Still 3. I whispered my call sign, no response. The breathing stopped. That was the first thing that didn't belong. We continued, slower now. I noticed our footsteps didn't echo the same way. Too many sounds, like someone walking a half step behind us. Mara heard it too. She leaned in, whispering that maybe another pair had crossed paths. I shook my head. Routes never intersected. Another rule. Then we saw a light, white, not red, flicker between the mausoleums. Someone was using a phone flashlight. That shouldn't have been possible. Gates were locked, everyone accounted for. I felt that cold slide of dread down my spine, the one you get when logic runs out of room. That's when it hit me. The problem wasn't that someone broke the rules. It was that whatever we were dealing with didn't know them. The radio came alive with overlapping voices. Not my family's. Too many syllables, wrong cadence. One voice tried to mimic my uncle's call sign, but got it slightly wrong, like it had learned by listening. Mara grabbed my hand hard enough to hurt. We turned back toward the gate, faster now, careful not to run. Footsteps picked up behind us. Not gravel, soft earth, fast. We broke into a sprint, red light bobbing wildly. I could hear breathing again, close enough to feel on my neck. I shouted for Mara to keep going and blew my whistle. The sound shattered the night. Radio screamed with feedback. Shapes moved between headstones, too tall, too thin, moving wrong. We burst through the gate just as headlights flared on. My father's truck. Others piled out, shouting, sweeping the grounds with full lights. The footsteps stopped instantly. Silence dropped like a held breath. Afterward, everyone talked at once. Some swore they saw faces that weren't faces. Others found unfamiliar footprints circling the inner paths, barefoot, deep. No one wanted to say the same thought out loud, that whatever had been there had walked with us before. Learned us. The cemetery is closed to us now. Tradition suspended. No official explanation. But last week, a red lens flashlight was left on my porch. Batteries still warm. Taped to it was a scrap of paper with one sentence written in careful, practiced handwriting. Next time, don't change the rules. Story 3. I took the opportunity because I was broke, exhausted, and desperate to prove, mostly to myself, that I wasn't stuck. Rent was overdue, my credit cards were maxed, and my girlfriend at the time had started using words like direction and stability in arguments. When I saw the posting for temporary overnight work at a historic cemetery restoration site, it felt like a lifeline. Good pay, short-term contract, immersive experience, the listing said. I ignored how vague that sounded. Looking back though, I was ignoring a lot more than bad wording. The job involved assisting a small team documenting older graves ahead of a preservation grant, photos, condition notes, mapping. Mostly night work to avoid daytime visitors and heat damage to equipment. I told myself it was just another gig, unusual, sure, but no worse than warehouse nights or security shifts I'd already done. My girlfriend wasn't thrilled. A cemetery, she asked. At night? I laughed it off, accused her of being dramatic. That argument lingered unresolved when I packed my bag. Planning was rushed. I joined 3 others I'd never met: Aaron, who acted like the unofficial leader, Jess, quiet but sharp, and Malik, who joked nonstop like he was trying to outrun his own nerves. The cemetery was in a rural pocket 2 hours from the city, surrounded by forest and accessed by a single cracked road. The host, a representative from the county historical office, sent us coordinates, not an address. That should have bothered me. It didn't. The first day we arrived just before sunset. The cemetery sprawled over a low hill, iron fencing bent and rusted, stones jutting at odd angles like broken teeth. A caretaker's shed sat near the entrance, but no one was there to greet us. The air felt heavy, humid, carrying the smell of pine sap and old soil. Cicadas screamed from the tree line. Aaron broke the silence with a whistle and said, "Well, this is it." No one laughed. We set up our equipment: DSLR cameras, tripods, handheld scanners, battery packs. Jess went over the workflow, calm and methodical. Malik complained about the lack of cell service. I focused on the stones, reading names worn nearly blank. Children, whole families, dates that ended abruptly. I told myself it was just history. Still, the place felt like it was watching us settle in. That night went smoothly enough. We worked in pairs, rotating sections. The moon was bright, and for a while, it almost felt peaceful. Around midnight, though, small tensions crept in. Aaron snapped when Malik wandered off path. Jess insisted we log everything twice. I caught myself jumping at sounds, branches cracking, wind sighing through mausoleums. Isolation does that, I figured. The first incident happened near the western boundary. Jess and I saw a light flicker between headstones, soft, yellow, like a lantern. We froze. No one else was scheduled to be there. Aaron insisted it was probably a nearby farmhouse. But the light moved, weaving low to the ground, then vanished behind a crypt. When we checked, there was nothing. No footprints, no source. After that, things escalated quickly. Equipment started malfunctioning. Fresh scratches appeared on the side of Malik's car, deep enough to peel paint. One morning, we found our supplies rearranged. Cameras stacked neatly, batteries drained completely. No signs of forced entry. Aaron tried to keep morale up, joked about ghost interns, but his voice was tight. On the third night, I was alone cataloging a row of sunken graves when I heard my name whispered, clear close. I spun around, heart pounding. No one. The radio crackled, but instead of static, a voice breathed, too deep. I dropped the unit and ran. We demanded answers the next morning. The county host arrived late, avoided eye contact, said old sites had quirks, that some areas weren't on official maps. He wouldn't explain the lights, wouldn't explain why local authorities hadn't responded when Malik called them the night before. He just told us to finish quickly. We didn't. That evening, a message was carved into the dirt beside our tent's "Leave what you take." Deep, deliberate letters. We packed up and drove out before full dark. Police reports went nowhere. The host stopped returning calls. Weeks later, I requested records about the cemetery. Everything was redacted, location classified, access restricted. When I pressed for details, the clerk leaned in and whispered, "That site isn't listed anymore." Then she slid my paperwork back and said nothing else. Story 4: I inherited the cemetery because no one else wanted it. That's the cleanest way to say it. My grandmother Lillian didn't leave behind much. No money, no jewelry worth fighting over, but she did leave me a key ring heavy enough to sag my pocket, and a deed written in careful cursive that transferred stewardship of a small, forgotten burial ground on the outskirts of town. When the lawyer slid the papers across the desk, he didn't meet my eyes. I should have known better than to sign without asking more questions. Gran had been the caretaker for as long as I could remember. She lived alone in a narrow house that backed up to the cemetery fence, her kitchen window facing rows of stones instead of neighbors. As kids, we weren't allowed past the gate. She said it wasn't fear, it was respect. The dead don't like being treated like scenery, she'd say. At the time, It sounded like one of her odd sayings, the kind you smile at and forget. The signs were all there, even then. After the funeral, it fell to me to clear out her house. I told myself it was practical, save on movers, sort what to keep. But really, I felt guilty leaving it to strangers. The house smelled like dust and lavender cleaner. Everything was exactly where she'd left it. Her coat still hung by the door. Her boots, mud-caked and heavy, waited by the back step that led toward the cemetery. In the spare bedroom, I found boxes labeled by year. Inside were notebooks, ledgers, folded maps of the grounds. I assumed they were maintenance records. Who was buried where? What stones needed repair? At first glance, they were. But mixed in were things that didn't fit, hand-drawn symbols beside certain plots. Notes about activity, restlessness, containment. There were jars, too, tucked into the closet, each sealed with wax and labeled with names I recognized from headstones outside. I laughed it off. Gran had been alone too long, that's all. Loneliness does strange things to people. I boxed everything up, telling myself I'd go through it properly later. If only I had listened to the small, insistent voice telling me to leave it all untouched. The first manifestation was easy to dismiss. A thump in the night, like something heavy settling. The house was old, then the lights flickered at exactly 2:11 am, 3 nights in a row. Bad wiring. When I started hearing footsteps pacing the fence line outside my bedroom window, I told myself it was animals. Foxes, maybe, raccoons. I should have known better when I found muddy footprints on my kitchen floor, bare, human-shaped, leading from the back door to the sink and stopping there. No prints leaving. I scrubbed the floor until my hands hurt and didn't tell anyone. Admitting it out loud would have made it real. Research came next, though I didn't call it that at the time. I started reading Gran's notebooks more carefully. Patterns emerged. Certain graves were marked more heavily. Some names appeared again and again with dates decades apart. I found old newspaper clippings tucked between pages, articles about unexplained deaths, missing persons last seen near the cemetery, always near, always unresolved. At the town library, I asked about my grandmother. The archivist hesitated, then brought out a thin folder. It held records of her volunteer service, assisting coroners during a bad flu season generations ago. Notes about emergency burials, rushed procedures. No one else had stayed on as caretaker after that period. Just her, and before her, her mother, and before that, her grandmother. The signs were all there. A legacy disguised as duty. Things escalated after I tried to reorganize the notebooks. That night, every clock in the house stopped at once. The air grew thick, pressing in on my ears. From outside came the sound of shovels scraping earth, slow and methodical. I ran to the window and saw shapes moving between the stones. Too many to count, their outlines blurring like heat haze. I tried desperate solutions. I burned some of the notebooks, convinced destroying the records would break whatever chain Gran had forged. The fire went out on its own, leaving the pages untouched, edges blackened but words intact. I called a priest. He refused to come once he heard the address. I contacted the county about selling the land. They told me it couldn't be transferred. Protected site, they said. Protected from what, they wouldn't explain. Now I understand. The caretaker doesn't own the cemetery. The cemetery owns the caretaker. Every night at 2:11 a.m., I walk the grounds, keys heavy in my hand, checking stones, tightening locks that don't keep anything out. I hear Gran's voice sometimes, correcting my rote, reminding me which graves need extra attention. I can't leave. When I tried, my car wouldn't start until I turned back. If only I had listened when she warned us away from the gate. If only I had known that inheritance isn't about what you gain, but what you're trapped continuing. Some responsibilities don't end with death. They just find someone new to carry them. Story 5. I took the job because my savings were gone and pride doesn't pay rent. I'd been laid off for 3 months, burning through credit and goodwill, when the listing popped up on a local board: night operations, assistant, historic grounds. No company name, no photos, just a phone number and a line about discretion required. The pay was higher than anything else I'd seen. Enough to catch up, enough to breathe. I told myself it was probably security or maintenance. I should have walked away when they offered me the position the same day I called. Orientation was at a low concrete building on the edge of town, tucked behind a row of cypress trees. There were 6 of us in the waiting room, all avoiding eye contact in that familiar way people do when they're competing, but don't want to admit it. A woman named Diane ran the onboarding. Clipboard, practiced smile, voice that never rose or fell. She collected our IDs, had us sign NDAs thicker than a phone book, and emphasized punctuality. "If you're late," she said, "don't come at all. No jokes, no small talk." The first day was training, mostly procedural. We were issued uniforms, dark, unmarked, and radios preset to a single channel. We met our supervisor, Mark, a man with permanent bags under his eyes who spoke like every word cost him something. He walked us through the grounds after sunset. Only then did I realize where we were working's an old cemetery, sprawling and uneven, with sections dating back to the 1800s. I felt a flicker of unease, but I tamped it down. Work is work. Strange protocols came next. No phones past the gate. No personal items on shift. Wallets locked in assigned lockers. Certain paths were off limits without written clearance. If an alarm sounded in Section D, we were to log it, not respond. If we heard voices after midnight, we were to report environmental noise and continue our route. None of it made sense, but everyone else nodded like this was normal. I did too. Coworker warnings were subtle. A guy named Louis told me quietly to keep my head down and never volunteer for overtime in the East Plots. Another woman, Jenna, asked how long I planned to stay. When I said, "As long as it takes," she winced. People disappeared from the schedule without explanation. Diane would announce their departure with a tight smile and redistribute shifts. No goodbye parties. No forwarding emails. The truth came to me on my 5th night. I was assigned to perimeter logging, easy work, Mark said. Around 2 a.m., an alarm tripped in a restricted section. My radio crackled with static and a phrase I hadn't heard before: "Containment check." Mark's voice followed, sharp: "Do not approach." I did anyway. The money wasn't worth it, but curiosity is a dangerous thing. In Section D, I saw a grave open from the inside. Soil bulged, then split. A hand emerged, gray, trembling, nails packed with dirt. Floodlights snapped on. Figures in heavier uniforms rushed past me, carrying tools I didn't recognize. They forced the coffin shut, reinforced the earth, sprayed something that made my eyes burn. One of them noticed me staring. That's when it hit me what the job really involved. They made it clear that quitting wasn't simple. Contracts had penalties. Breaches had consequences. Mark pulled me aside later, voice low. "You saw something you weren't cleared for," he said. "That means you're cleared now." I was scheduled for containment duty the next night. I lasted 2 weeks. I still hear the alarms in my sleep. I finally escaped by taking a job 3 states away, leaving everything else behind. My RA Summe has a gap I can't explain. I flinch at radio static. I don't work nights anymore. My career is permanently altered. Not because I quit, but because I learned some jobs change what you're allowed to believe about the world, and once you know, you can't unknow it. Story 6. I didn't choose isolation so much as agree to it, without understanding the cost. The contract was clear enough. Temporary solo assignment, on-site presence required, no relief staff until conditions cleared. Heavy storms had washed out the access road to the cemetery's upper grounds, and someone had to stay behind to monitor flood damage and ensure no graves were exposed. It was supposed to be 3 days, maybe 4. The weather made it impossible to leave, and the rules made it impossible for anyone to come get me. The caretaker's lodge sat in the center of the grounds, a squat stone building with narrow windows and a generator that hummed like a nervous animal. I stocked supplies, tested radios, logged my arrival time in the official book. I even joked to myself about the quiet. I'd worked night shifts before. I liked being alone. Silence felt like rest. The first day passed easily. I established a routine: morning perimeter check, afternoon paperwork, evening rounds before dark. I marked everything in my logbook, careful and precise. The cemetery looked the same from every angle. Rows of headstones softened by moss, trees bending under rain, heavy wind. The storm howled outside, but inside the lodge it was warm, contained, manageable. By the second night, the routine settled into something comforting. I stopped checking the clock so often. The generator's hum blended into the background. I cooked from cans, read old manuals left behind by previous caretakers. I slept deeply, dreamlessly. When I woke, I wrote the time down, though I couldn't remember checking my watch. I assumed I had. Subtle changes crept in quietly. My boots were damp when I went to put them on, though I was sure I'd dried them by the heater. The chair at the small kitchen table was angled differently than I remembered. Once, I found the radio volume turned all the way down, though I always left it at mid-level. I blamed the isolation. Long hours alone can play tricks on you. Time started behaving oddly. My watch lost minutes, then gained them back. The wall calendar skipped a day, the page already torn off when I went to mark it. I corrected it, annoyed with myself. In my logbook, I noticed entries written in my handwriting that I didn't remember making. Short notes, like checked south fence twice or heard movement near section F. I told myself I'd simply forgotten. Fatigue does that. By the 4th day, doubt settled in. I reread earlier entries and found contradictions. Times didn't line up. Events overlapped impossibly. One page described a full perimeter walk completed in 20 minutes, something that should have taken at least an hour. I started adding more detail, trying to anchor myself. Dates, weather notes, exact times. Still, the gaps grew. The silence became oppressive. Not the absence of sound, but its sameness. Wind, generator, my own breathing, over and over. At night, I'd hear something else layered beneath it all. A faint dragging sound, distant, repetitive. I convinced myself it was debris shifting in the storm. When I checked the grounds, nothing was disturbed. Outside confirmation came unexpectedly. On the 6th day, the radio crackled to life with a voice I didn't recognize. It asked me to confirm my status. Relief washed through me so hard my knees went weak. I answered immediately, gave my name, my location. There was a pause. Then the voice said, "You've already logged that." Twice. The transmission cut off before I could respond. That night, I found muddy footprints circling the lodge. Not leading away, just circling. I locked the door and sat awake until morning, clutching my logbook like proof I existed. My watch stopped entirely at 3:12 a.m. Every clock in the lodge showed the same time. The breaking point came when I opened the logbook to find an entry dated the next day, written in my handwriting. "It doesn't leave when you stop watching." I screamed then, loud and ragged, the sound tearing out of me. The dragging noise answered, closer now, scraping just outside the walls. Rescue came late that afternoon when the storm finally broke and a crew reached the lodge. They found me sitting in the corner, unshaven, shaking, surrounded by open notebooks and calendars torn to pieces. I kept asking them what day it was. None of their answers matched. I went home after medical leave, tried to return to normal life. But sometimes my watch still stops at 3:12. Sometimes my journal has new entries in the morning, and sometimes, late at night, I hear that same dragging sound, steady, patient, moving through my hallway like the isolation never really ended, just followed me somewhere quieter. Story 7. I didn't go looking for trouble. I was driving past the cemetery on my way home from a late shift when I saw the lights. Too bright, too organized to be teenagers or vandals. Floodlights cut through the fog, illuminating a section of graves that should have been dark and locked after dusk. I slowed, told myself to keep moving, but then I saw them carrying something long and heavy between the headstones. Not a coffin. Not wrapped the way it should have been. Something moved inside it. I pulled over without thinking, phone already in my hand. I took photos from behind my windshield, grainy, zoomed, but clear enough to show uniforms. Dark jackets with reflective patches, radios clipped at the shoulder. One of them lifted his head, and even at a distance I could see his face was calm, almost bored. That was the moment dread settled in. Whatever I was seeing, they weren't surprised by it. The response was immediate. A patrol car rolled up behind me within minutes, lights flashing but siren off. The officer approached slowly, hand resting near his badge, posture relaxed. He asked if my car was having trouble. I said no. I said I'd seen something strange in the cemetery. His expression didn't change. Another vehicle arrived, then a third. Too many for a routine check. They asked for my phone, framed it as a request, not an order. I hesitated. The officer smiled and said, "Let's clear this up quickly." I handed it over. He scrolled, nodded, and handed it back. The photos were gone. Not deleted, gone like they'd never existed. He told me the cemetery was undergoing authorized maintenance, that nothing unusual had occurred. His tone was practiced, like he'd said those words many times before. The gaslighting started that night and never really stopped. When I called the non-emergency line later to file a report, the dispatcher told me there was no record of any activity at the cemetery. When I went in person the next day, the desk sergeant couldn't find my call in the system. He suggested I might have been tired, overworked. "These things happen," he said gently. I kept my own records, wrote everything down, times, badge numbers. I remembered one clearly, etched on the metal, just below the eagle crest. When I requested officer rosters for that night, the list I received didn't include anyone matching that number. I checked again, same result. The paperwork looked official, letterhead, signatures, but something about the formatting felt off, like a copy of a copy. Contradictory evidence piled up quietly. My phone's cloud backup showed gaps where the photos should have been. A witness I tracked down, an older man who lived across from the cemetery, initially confirmed seeing lights. When I went back a week later, he denied ever speaking to me, said he didn't remember me at all. His daughter watched from the doorway, arms crossed, eyes hard. I started digging through public archives, old incident logs, zoning disputes, health department notices. That's where the pattern emerged, small reports spanning decades. Complaints about noises, unauthorized burials, temporary closures with vague explanations. Each file ended the same way, no further action required. Case numbers crossed out and reassigned, names redacted. Always the same language. A man visited me at work one afternoon. He wore a plain suit, carried a leather folder, and flashed a badge too quickly for me to read. He said he was with municipal oversight. We sat in a break room that suddenly felt too small. He told me I was misinterpreting events and that continued inquiries could create complications. He leaned in and lowered his voice. "Some things stay contained because they have to," he said. It sounded like a warning rehearsed just enough to feel sincere. I tried to expose it anyway, sent emails to journalists, filed FOI requests. Every message bounced or vanished. One reporter called me back, intrigued, then never answered again. My requests were marked fulfilled with empty attachments. At one point, my entire email thread disappeared, replaced by an automated notice thanking me for my interest. After that, I noticed the surveillance. A sedan parked across from my apartment at odd hours. The same man on my commute, always one car back. My internet cut out whenever I searched certain terms. When I called my provider, they said there was no outage logged. My own notes began to feel unreliable. Pages missing. Sentences crossed out that I didn't remember writing. Last week, a certified letter arrived. Official seal, case number in bold. It stated that the incident I reported had been reviewed and formally closed. No evidence found, no ongoing concerns. The wording was final, absolute. Case closed. I stood at my window afterward, watching the cemetery lights flicker on in the distance, brighter than they'd ever been. Whatever I saw that night is still there. Still happening. They just decided I wasn't allowed to see it anymore. Story 8. We hired the guide because none of us knew the cemetery well enough to pretend we were in control. It was an old place, sprawling, overgrown, with sections that didn't appear on modern maps. And our project depended on moving through it efficiently after dark. The listing recommended him specifically for after-hours navigation and safety. That phrasing should have bothered me. Instead, it reassured me. An expert meant fewer risks. His name was Calder. That's what he told us, anyway. He showed up early, already waiting by the rusted main gate when our van pulled in. He looked the part: weathered jacket, heavy boots, a flashlight clipped to his belt, a folded map tucked into an inner pocket like it lived there. He shook each of our hands, remembered our names after hearing them once, and spoke with the calm authority of someone used to being listened to. Establishing trust came easily for him. He talked about years spent working historical sites, about guiding survey teams and restoration crews through places people forget too easily. He knew the cemetery's history without checking notes. Who was buried where? Which sections flooded? Which mausoleums shifted in winter? He carried a small radio and insisted we all stay on the same channel. No freelancing, he said with a smile. This place punishes arrogance. The first hour went smoothly. Calder set a comfortable pace, stopping often to let us check equipment and log coordinates. He pointed out hazards before we noticed them. Sunken ground, loose stone, unstable fences. Every instruction made sense. When he corrected us, it felt protective, not controlling. I remember thinking how lucky we were to have found him. Minor deviations started subtly. He adjusted the route on the fly, ignoring the printed plan we'd agreed on. Paths shift, he said lightly, tapping the map. Paper doesn't keep up. He led us through a narrow section I didn't recognize, assuring us it was a shortcut. Our radios crackled there, static heavy enough to drown out voices. Calder told us not to worry. Dead zones, he said. Happens. The quiet manipulation took longer to notice. He suggested splitting into smaller pairs, to cover more ground, despite earlier insisting we stay together. He paired me with him, leaving the others behind with vague instructions. When I asked if we should regroup, he waved it off. They know the drill, he said. Trust me. He started feeding me small bits of misinformation, claiming certain graves had already been documented when I knew they hadn't, insisting sounds we heard were animals when they were clearly rhythmic, deliberate. Each time I questioned him, he had an answer ready. Each answer chipped away at my confidence, not his. The moment of doubt came when he referenced something I hadn't told anyone. We were standing near an unmarked plot, my flashlight beam shaking slightly, when Calder said, "This is where you'll want to be careful. You don't want another incident like the one in Oak Ridge." My stomach dropped. Oak Ridge was a cemetery I'd worked at years earlier, a private mistake, one that never made it into any report. I asked how he knew about that. He smiled, slow and patient. I read people better than paperwork, he said. It's part of the job. The revelation unfolded without drama, which somehow made it worse. Calder led me to a mausoleum off the main path, its door already open. Inside were markings carved into the stone, symbols that matched ones I'd seen in old manuals, the kind most people dismissed as decorative flourishes. Calder spoke differently there, reverently. He talked about keeping routes clear, about feeding access, about guides being necessary so others wouldn't wander where they weren't meant to. That's when it hit me. He wasn't guiding us through the cemetery. He was guiding the cemetery to us. The confrontation was brief and pointless. I backed away, demanded he let me leave. He didn't block the exit. He didn't need to. "You'll get out," he said. "Most do. That's not the service I provide." His radio crackled then, not with static but with voices layered too closely together. He listened, nodded, and stepped aside. I ran until my lungs burned, until I burst back onto a familiar path where the others were waiting, pale and shaken. Calder was gone. We left immediately, abandoning equipment, filing reports that went nowhere. Authorities said there was no record of a licensed guide by that name. The cemetery closed shortly after for structural review. Months later, scrolling through listings for a new job, I saw a familiar photo. A man standing confidently at the edge of a different cemetery, flashlight on his belt, map tucked into his jacket. The ad read, "Experience guide available. After hours navigation a specialty." Story 9. The routine was explained to me the same way you explain how to lock up at the end of a shift. Casual, efficient, unremarkable. Every morning at sunrise, I was to walk the eastern paths of the cemetery, pause at every third headstone, straighten anything that had shifted, and tap the stone twice before moving on. Tap, tap. Not hard, just enough to feel it. It keeps things orderly. My supervisor said that was it. No deeper meaning, just routine. At first, I liked the simplicity of it. My life outside the cemetery was chaotic. Missed calls, unpaid bills, relationships strained by my constant exhaustion. Here, the task was clear, predictable. I showed up, followed the path, did the motions. Tap, tap, straighten, move on. The repetition was soothing, like counting steps or breaths. The learning phase happened gradually. No formal training, just observation. I watched how the older workers did it, how they timed their steps so the taps landed evenly, how they never spoke while performing the walk. When I asked why, they smiled and said talking broke concentration. "You don't want to lose your place," one of them told me. That made sense. Losing your place in a cemetery felt disrespectful. Subtle symbolism crept in without announcement. I noticed everyone tapped with their right hand. I switched once, absent-mindedly, and a coworker gently corrected me. "Right hand," she said, like reminding someone which side of the road to drive on. We all used the same phrase when we finished a row. That's set. No one told me to say it. I just did, because everyone else did. The timing mattered too. Sunrise wasn't flexible. 5 minutes early was too early. 5 minutes late earned a look, not angry, just disappointed. On certain days, we lingered longer at specific stones, repeating the tap 3 times instead of 2. When I asked about that, I was told, some days need extra care. Pattern recognition hit me slowly, the way realization does when you don't want it to. I started noticing dates carved into stones that matched the days we did the longer pauses. Anniversaries. Not of deaths, but of something else. Fires, accidents, disappearances I remembered from old news stories. When I checked the calendar, my stomach tightened. The routine aligned perfectly with them. The hidden purpose revealed itself in fragments. A phrase muttered under breath. A note in an old logbook that wasn't meant for me. Keeps it fed. Someone had written, followed by a shaky correction. Keeps it settled. I told myself it was metaphorical. That cemeteries inspire strange language. That normalization happens in any job if you stay long enough. Resistance didn't start dramatically. It started with hesitation. One morning, I skipped a tap, just one. Nothing happened immediately. No alarms, no reprimand. I felt a small, rebellious thrill. The next day, I skipped two. That night, I dreamed of knocking from beneath the earth, steady and patient. Tap, tap. The consequences were immediate once I fully stopped. A stone I hadn't tapped cracked down the middle. A coworker tripped and broke her wrist on ground that had always been level. The supervisor pulled me aside, voice low. "You're disrupting the balance," he said. Not threatening, matter of fact, like explaining gravity. I quit the next day. Walked out mid-routine, ignoring the looks, the whispered that set trailing after me. I told myself I was free. That routines only have power if you participate. Weeks later, driving past the cemetery, I saw a new crew on the eastern path, different faces, same motions, right hand tap, tap, straighten, move on. In unison, they murmured, "That's set." Story 10, before any of this happened, my life was quiet in the best way. Predictable. I lived with my partner, Elaine, in a small house that backed up to Green Hollow Cemetery. That was the compromise. We got cheaper rent, and she got the proximity she wanted for her work. Elaine cataloged burial records for the city, mostly remote, sometimes on site. I teased her about living next to her office. She teased me back about never needing curtains on that side of the house because, as she put it, the neighbors don't look back. We had routines. Morning coffee on the back porch, watching fog settle between headstones. Evening walks along the fence line. She'd point out stones she'd worked on, tell me small human stories hidden behind dates and names. I loved how grounded she was, how steady. That steadiness is why I noticed when it began to slip. The first change was subtle enough that I almost missed it. Elaine stopped humming while she worked. She always hummed, soft, tuneless sounds she didn't even realize she made. One afternoon I mentioned it, joking that the house felt too quiet. She looked up at me, confused, and said, "I don't hum." Her tone wasn't defensive, just factual. I laughed it off, assumed I was wrong. Then she started taking longer walks alone in the cemetery. At first, it made sense, deadlines, stress, needing space. But she stopped telling me where she was going. When I asked, she'd say, "The usual paths," without elaborating. Elaine used to narrate everything. Silence didn't suit her. Physical inconsistencies followed, small but intimate. She cut her finger chopping vegetables one night, a shallow slice across her knuckle. It healed too cleanly, leaving no mark at all. Elaine scarred easily. She always had. Her handwriting shifted too, still neat, but heavier, more angular. When I pointed it out, she smiled and said people's writing changes over time. Everyone else agreed with her when I mentioned it casually. "Stress does that," her sister said. "You're overthinking." The personal items were worse. Elaine wore her grandmother's ring every day, a thin silver band with a tiny crack along the inside. One morning, the crack was gone. The ring felt colder when she handed it to me, heavier somehow. She insisted it was the same ring. I apologized for upsetting her. Social gaslighting settled in like fog. Friends told me Elaine seemed great, happier even. Her coworkers praised her productivity. When I tried to explain that something felt wrong, the words sounded ridiculous out loud. "She doesn't hum anymore. Her ring feels wrong." I stopped bringing it up. Doubt works that way. It isolates you gently. The proof phase came by accident. I was looking for an old video on my phone and found a recording from 2 years earlier. Elaine was sitting on the porch, laughing at something off camera, humming without realizing it. The sound hit me like a physical blow. I watched it 3 times, then compared it to a recent video I'd taken last week. Same face, same voice, No humming, not even when she laughed. I started digging quietly, old voicemails, texts, photos. In some of the photos taken near the cemetery, Elaine's shadow didn't align with her body. I know how that sounds. I told myself it was angles, lighting. But once you see it, you can't unsee it. The confrontation happened late, after midnight. I couldn't sleep. Elaine was sitting at the kitchen table, hands folded, staring out the window toward the graves. I asked her directly if she was still Elaine. She didn't react the way I expected. No anger, no denial. She sighed. Like someone tired of pretending. She said, "I'm what stayed." That was all she offered at first. When I pressed, she admitted partial truths in careful pieces. That Elaine had spent too much time listening during her work. That some places don't just hold bodies, they hold roles. That when someone leaves a space empty long enough, something else finishes the job. She wouldn't explain how, wouldn't explain when. Only that the original Elaine was accounted for. Loss isn't always loud. Sometimes it's sitting across from someone who looks exactly like the person you love. Realizing that love has nowhere to land, I stopped sleeping in our bed. The replacement didn't object. It moved through our life flawlessly, kept appointments, laughed at the right moments, held my hand with practiced familiarity. Now, months later, no one questions her. She's fully integrated. I'm the only variable that doesn't fit. Sometimes she watches me the way Elaine used to watch the cemetery, attentive and patient. Last night, I caught my reflection in the back window, doubled faintly by the glass. For a moment, my shadow didn't move when I did. Elaine, whatever wears her name now, touched my arm gently and said, "You've been spending a lot of time thinking about this place." Her fingers were cold. Familiar. Wrong.